Hello students, welcome to your week 11 highlights video. Let's jump right in to Emma Rose's article that she wrote along with some collaborators. So the article is called Community-Based User Experience, Evaluating the Usability of Health Insurance Information with Immigrant Patients. So she describes how in this study they are exemplifying the movement from a system-centered approach to a user-centered approach, as is the backstory of user-centered design. And she asks, along with her colleagues, Rose et al., how have nonprofits perhaps unevenly been enveloped by this user-oriented approach? What are nonprofits' specific challenges when it comes to involving UX approaches? If they're often used in a corporate setting or in a product development context, what happens when these approaches are used in a nonprofit setting where the people who are the consumers of information or a product or a service are humans, and it's the interface between them and the organization that actually needs to be studied, as is the case with the community organization that they discuss later in the article. So I would ask, what is Rose et al.'s population of study and their product of focus? So if we think about that concretely at the start of this conversation, we begin to see how perhaps some of our standard or canonical definitional concepts around UX and usability testing need to be adapted when they are applied in a nonprofit or community-centered context. So I found it very concise and effective how these authors defined UX by the ISO definition, which is the International Standards Organization, and briefly covered the history of UX and its interface with TPC. And I've put the page references on here so you can go back and look at the article yourself and make sure you catch these also, or that you caught them when you read through it. So in a similar no-nonsense fashion, and I did love how concisely written this was, I thought it was really powerful, the authors reveal various practices for usability testing and constraints to consider relative to these approaches. So in describing the relationship between TPC history with community engagement and with the direction of this study in UX, Rose speaks about this concept of shifting power. So when you're working with a community partner, whether it's in community engaged or participatory practices or service learning, quote unquote, in TechCom, which I've done some work in myself, you have to realize that you are shifting power to the partner organization. You are there to serve them and help their constituents, the population that they serve. My students have worked with Animal Humane, and indeed the population that they serve is not even human, it's animals, so, and their prospective owners. So this sort of does piggyback on the article that we read for last week, but I want you to think about how in a local context in Seattle, in a particular moment, which was an ACA enrollment period among a population that spoke Vietnamese and Cantonese, how some of the definitional concepts around UX that you've been reading about all semester had to be applied and adapted specifically in this new domain. So a key underlying message of work in localized UX, such as you read about, is that translation of materials is in no way enough. It's not enough to just take, for example, an English language text and translate it, whether through Google Translate or another tool, into another language. In fact, there are many great examples of how that doesn't work well. Rose et al. Emphasize as their second theme in the literature that translation and translators indeed have a very crucial role, an elemental role, and they're part of the research team, the study team. So how do Rose et al. Differentiate participatory design from user-centered design? We've read about both. I want you to think about the sites of emergence of both of these themes in the history of UX, and make sure that you can think about their kind of genealogy differently. So the nonprofit partner was crucial to Rose et al.'s work, as the immigrant populations were engaged through the mechanism already through the work of the nonprofit and existing structures of this nonprofit. So the relationships were already there. There was a level of trust between the community partner and the community that they served. And so Rose et al., they came in, the research team, they came in, and they partnered and were in fact led by the community partner nonprofit organization. So How do you understand this quote by Walton and team? And Rebecca Walton is a very prominent voice in social justice oriented TechCom. And the quote is this: power is not centralized with researchers. So where is it centralized, or is it not centralized? I think that's a really good question. So think about that. So this is an image from the article that you read. It's a Venn diagram of where the interests of UX practitioners, or the expertise, and of the nonprofit staff, where they overlap and what common goals, orientations are across these two groups. So Rose and her team offer such a succinct definition of usability testing. I thought this was really elegant and clean. In usability testing, representative users attempt to complete realistic tasks while an interdisciplinary team collects empirical data and analyzes those data to make improvements. Now, this might sound rather staid, rather unembellished, quite elemental, and indeed it is, but it does describe the practice that took place in this study and many others. It's very translatable and transportable. So table 1 on page 219 is very interesting to you, I hope. I want you to look at it in the way that they describe the tasks in the left-hand column and the scenarios in the right-hand column. As you're designing your own usability test, I'd like you to take a look at that. So examine this group's testing approach on page 220 as it might inform yours. How did they modify the Think Aloud protocol, and what did they decide relative to quantitative metrics? How they kind of revise their initial assumptions and approaches is very revelatory, I think. So what is significant about the way the research team presented their results to the staff? Did they offer hard recommendations? Did they use some of the basically foundational methodologies within UX, or did they adapt them to suit the immediate context in which they were partnering and collaborating? And what did their study reveal about the patient's understanding of health insurance as conveyed in the original guidebook? I loved reading that part of the study where they actually dove into some of the comments offered by folks who were a part of the test about their experience with these guidebooks and what they understood and didn't understand. So in community contexts, is it problematic to, quote, adhere to a more corporate or standardized view of UX and UX practice? I think that's a leading question, because I think you probably know that the answer is yes, it is problematic to be locked into those corporate or standardized practices. So again, I hope that you found this study to be really interesting and really illustrative of some things you might consider in your own study or in future UX work that you might do going forward. So thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you next week.